are relatively consistent across generations within a family, or consistent over someone's life trajectory. But in Moldova and in Crimea, which is the other case of my research, there were clear disagreements within families that demonstrated how meanings can intersect with different political and socialization experiences. So what narratives are permitted at one period of time and how they change, and how these narratives kind of infuse education and political systems and people's lives and people's experiences and how they articulate themselves. So both kind of education and political systems were key to socialization beyond the family, and could kind of result in different and sometimes opposite understandings of self-identification, that people within families, so like adult children and parents, would narrate very different forms of identification. They might even use similar names for self-identification and opposing, but actually have very different meanings behind those kind of ethonyms. So one example, this is where I'm going to wrap up, is a participant that told me in Crimea about New Year's Eve celebrations. And again, this is an example of how you can kind of elicit and observe the nation through asking a combination of direct and indirect questions. So she celebrated only on local Crimean Ukrainian time, New Year's Eve. But her mother, in line with Soviet traditions, would celebrate twice, local time and Moscow time. It's worth bearing in mind that this, I'm talking about Crimea before 2014, when Crimea was on Ukrainian Kiev time. Since Russian annexation, Russian authorities have imposed Moscow Russian time. So again, it kind of demonstrates how these everyday narratives can also infuse political institutions as those political institutions shift socialization within the Ukrainian state and constructed Crimea as a legitimate and normal part of Ukraine. So it's just one example of kind of how it was possible through interviews to kind of observe these different meanings, and how those meanings were kind of consequential, both in terms of practices and in terms of understanding the nation and constructing these self-other boundaries. So she imagined herself as part of a Ukrainian self constructed in relation to Russia, and she articulated her mother as kind of part of the Russian self constructed in relation to Ukrainian other. So there are other examples that I could give, but this is just the one that I wanted to focus on today, as an example of kind of using an ethnographic sensibility via interviews aligned with an everyday nationalism approach to understand these kind of intergenerational experiences of practices and meaning making. And I will wrap up there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Ellie. That was fascinating. Jon, can we hand over to you?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Ellie. That was great. And I agree with all that. And I'll come back to some of those points that you might think I might disagree with, but I don't really. So that was a good start. I'm Jon Fox. I'm a sociologist from the University of Bristol. And I like to think of myself as an ethnographer. I should probably be using the past tense because it's been a while since I've done ethnography, the constraints of doing research now and the type of immersion that Ellie was talking about earlier. But I'm very happy to be invited to speak at a roundtable about ethnography because I still feel strongly about it and invested in it. So ethnography, nationalism, and me. So my interest is, so I want to go back to some of the things that Ellie was saying earlier about interviewing, because that's actually where I began, not as an ethnographer, but as someone doing interviews. And I was interested in questions of national identity in Transylvania. So questions of national identity, mostly initially amongst Hungarians, but then later amongst Romanians as well. And so I began interviewing Transylvanian Hungarians about their national identity, specifically in this little village that was about 3/4 Hungarian, about 1/4 Romanian. It was near Târgu Mureș, for those of you who know something about Transylvanian geography. For those of you who don't, just skip over it. It doesn't matter for our purposes today. Anyhow, the point is I was talking to these Hungarian villagers about their national identity, and I found two things in this national identity research, neither of them what Ellie was talking about, but she's a more accomplished interviewer than me, or than I was. So when I talked to these Hungarian villagers about their national identity, the first thing I discovered was that they like to talk about these things. They talked about what it meant to them to be Hungarian and stuff, and what it was to be Hungarian and what it was to be Hungarian in a Romanian country and all these sorts of things. So they had a lot to say about these things. The second thing, I don't want this to sound not very nice, but the interviews are pretty boring, at least for me. I mean, I'm sure this says a lot more about me than it says about the people I was interviewing. But I think I was asking this sort of, I was doing bad national identity research, asking bad national identity questions, not the kind of thing that Ellie was describing earlier. So it's not that, I mean, there's a lot of good national identity research out there. And Ellie does some of that, and lots of other people do that as well. But I wasn't very good at it. And so the questions I was getting, they were just, it showed to me that they had this kind of capacity to talk about national identity, but everything they were saying, it just seemed like, bad versions of what I was hearing in political discourse and things like that. This kind of, attempt to mimic what their political representatives were taking. And it wasn't, it wasn't so interesting to me. So I just felt like it wasn't telling me very much. And so my bad research was good, and that it led me to ethnography, right? So it led me away from this kind of what question of national identity. What does national identity mean to people, to more of the when and the how question. And Ellie and I didn't discuss this before, but what did you say, Ellie? You said the who, the what, and the why. Well, looks like ethnography does everything then, because I'm going to bring in the when and how to this as well, because those are the questions that I was interested in with ethnography. So I found out with the what question that there was this practical capacity to talk about what the nation meant to people, but what I didn't see was how that was relevant to people. And for that, I thought I needed a different kind of approach, and that approach was ethnography, right? So how to understand not so much national identity. Now, nationhood more generally is something I was becoming interested in. It's something that could be, I mean, it's just a bit more nebulous. It could involve national identity, but it can involve other manifestations of nationhood. So the question then became how do we appreciate when nationhood matters? Nationhood is a kind of everyday category of practice, matters in people's everyday lives. And for that, I think I needed this kind of what I referred to elsewhere earlier in my career as a kind of wait and listen approach, right? So just sit back, wait, listen, and take it in. The immersion stuff that Ellie was talking about. And in a sense, I was actually already doing that. I mean, may not have had the ethical approval or the awareness that I was doing ethnography, but I was living in Transylvania, first in a village, later in cities and things like that, taking it all in. I was observing everyday life in Transylvania, and I was observing nationhood in everyday life, although I wasn't always attuned to it. But I think that was a good kind of entry into the field at that point. Now, of course, I was an interloper. I'm not from Transylvania. I'm not a native speaker of Hungarian or Romanian, but as an interloper, I was able to perhaps see things that other people were less aware of, things that were shrouded in the mystery of everyday practice or everyday routine and habits and things like that, that they became automatic for them rather than things that they were self-aware of. So anyhow, this was my gradual entry into the world of ethnography, where I decided this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try to understand how nationhood manifests in the everyday lives of people in Transylvania. Hungarians first, and then I became interested in Romanians as well, looking at Hungarians and Romanians. And what I discovered for me was that ethnography really just changed my relationship to the research field, to the field that I was investigating, but also to questions of nationalism as well. And it changes the way I would see things. It allowed me to see things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, and not see things that I would have seen with a kind of more conventional interviewing approach. So things like national identity became less relevant to my ethnography, to the ethnography that I was doing, because people weren't talking about national identity, right? It's not something I could go to the pub, I could hang out with people in different contexts, visit them in their homes and stuff. And if I ask those questions, of course people respond to them. But when I don't ask those questions, it's frankly just something that people aren't typically talking about. Right? So they don't go to the pub and say, well, I'm feeling particularly Hungarian tonight, or I'm really proud to be Romanian or something. I mean, actually it is possible. And I have heard things similar to that, but it's not that common. So it's not the kind of thing that we talk about. It's something we talk with instead. It's a category for making sense of other things in the world. So instead, I saw things like what I referred to as nationhood. not quite sure how to define that, but as I said, it's a bit more nebulous and it's the kind of more specific national identity. It's not about it's a thing that we have, it's this kind of category for understanding the world in which we live. It's the practical category of the nation as a way of seeing the world, as an institutional form, sometimes as a commodity or something like that, as a discourse or a ritual, as an everyday practice. And so these were the things that I was becoming more attuned to. And sometimes those things would jump out at me, right? They would take sort of more explicit forms, right? They'd be obvious, right? They'd be inscribed in national symbols or encoded in discourse or the talk of people. They've been materialized in different practices or commodities, as I said earlier, right? In the clothing that we wear or different sorts of things like that. And those were kind of, the things that I probably noticed first. So how nationhood manifested in these more kind of obvious ways in everyday life. Sometimes, however, it was less tangible. So the unseen, the unheard, the unspoken versions of nationhood that Michael Billig talks about in Banal Nationalism. Nationhood when it's everywhere and nowhere. It's ubiquitous, but invisible precisely because it's ubiquitous. It's stealthily doing its work in the background of everyday life without becoming the object of explicit talk or interaction. So those are things like the nationally inflected institutional routines. And I think the example that Ellie just gave from Crimea and the time there is an example of that. Of course, in the interview setting, she can pursue that further and get other understandings of that. But just the way we register time, right? That can be institutionally inflected, that can be institutionally determined and nationally inflected. And you may not notice it at first, so you may not think of that as a national practice, but I think Ellie shows us that it really is, or it can be in many contexts. Ritual practices, right? Those are other things that may not kind of wave the flag of nationalism, although we have ritual practices that do that as well. But other times they're more subtle ritual practices, everyday routines and practices, those sorts of things that can again be nationally inflected. Non-national discourse doing national work. So I'm thinking here of Billig's discussion of pronouns and stuff, right? Nothing inherently national about she or he. But she and he and they and them can do national work in certain contexts in ways that are implicitly national. So all these examples and many other examples like this, we can see nationhood more on kind of autopilot. It's not the focus of routine talk and interaction, but it's there in the background, informing the focus in certain ways. And it requires it requires powers of observation to kind of see that. It requires mostly time, because a lot of that stuff is invisible to us. It's invisible to the users of those categories, but it's invisible. It can be invisible to us as well. I think I had a particularly helpful vantage point when I was doing my research as an outsider. So the things that were routine to these people, nothing was routine to me, right? So I was able to see things that they may have been taking for granted precisely because I was an outsider, and these things looked, not ordinary to me, but extraordinary to me. And so I was able to see them in that way. So I'm calling all of this ethnography, and ultimately I did have ethical approval for it, so don't worry. But it's just everyday life, isn't it? It's just me in everyday life and living there, spending the time that I did there. And taking all these things in and then taking notes after the fact. It's the knowledge or the data that we harvest from this accrues from our immersion in everyday life, what Ellie was talking about a moment ago. And as I said, as an outsider, as a non-native speaker of Hungarian, as a non-native speaker of Romanian, I'm sure I missed loads and loads of stuff, but I also saw things that may have been somewhat less visible to the insiders there. The problem, kind of coming back to this question, and Ellie flagged this up as well, and where I began my little intervention here is that the problem with national identity research, or I shouldn't say that, the problem with the national identity research that I did, where I began, is that it doesn't only contribute to the overdetermination of nationalism. It contributes to a particular version of the overdetermination of nationalism, one that suggests that nationalism, the politics of nationalism, resonates with people in their everyday lives. Again, something that Ellie was speaking to. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I don't think it does to the extent that we can go out and ask people about their national identities, and we can come away thinking, oh, people are really invested in this. And they are invested when we ask them those questions, but when are they invested outside of that? The everyday life bit of that is missing. Ethnography ultimately shows us that nationhood is important in everyday life. So it's not, at least the ethnography that I've done, this does not suggest that nationhood is not important in everyday life, but it's just not necessarily important in the ways that we would expect from a more top-down epistemological starting point. Nationalism, as Billig reminds us, is itself overdetermined in a sense, right? So it's a banal and ubiquitous feature of everyday life. Our job as ethnographers is not to overdetermine specific forms of it, to overstress certain forms of it, but to capture it in its variation and variability in everyday life. And I still think ethnography is very well suited for that. I just wish I could do more of it. So I'll end with that and hand things over to the other Jon, and I guess we'll open it up for discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Jon. It was fascinating. And I suspect you're better than you let on. So, yeah, let me kind of take up the caboose, the end of the train here. I'm slightly different in that I was trained as an anthropologist. I did my PhD in anthropology. I always expected to be doing ethnography, and that's kind of how I got into my first PhD was a study of national and devolution politics in Scotland in the early 1990s that led to my first book. And there I was kind of interested in, like a lot of ethnographers, like going to the field and I sort of had a plan and then I bolted up and threw it away and did different things. But I ended up working through various kind of networks and of campaigning organizations and just kind of, in a kind of snowball way, moving, adding groups to the list of people I worked with to try and get different angles on people kind of fairly normal, not top level politicians, but just kind of average people involved in campaigning organizations, how they were talking and thinking about nationalism, the nationalist project in Scotland in the 90s. This is before devolution happens in 1997. And, so that we had this sense of a head of steam building up around this project. And like a lot of ethnographers, it's a combination of classic participant observation, watching things happen. When you do it, when there's a movement like that in front of you, what are we doing today? We're going to a political rally. There's less of this problem of just waiting for it to happen because you're kind of in a particular stream where it is happening. And I did interviews with people as well to kind of augment and actually ask the questions explicitly, which I think most ethnographers who spend a year or more in the field do. They kind of combine the participant observation and some interviewing and focus group kind of sessions. It's kind of a mixture. The next bit of ethnography I did was in kind of early 2000s. I was 2001, 2002, which was again, Billig's banal nationalism and talk of everyday nationalism was becoming much more prevalent. And I was part of a big Leverhulme project that was looking at changes in national identity in the context of devolution and what impact was that having on people's national identities, to which one of the answers we found was not a whole lot because those identities were already so high, they'd sort of hit their ceiling. But one part of this multi-team kind of multi-project was an ethnography where I was and I and another ethnographer were working in kind of Scottish institutions, organizational context. Nigel was working in the NHS, and I was working in the Bank of Scotland. The idea was to sort of look at these sleepy, august institutions that are in some ways very banal. They're just chugging along, doing their kind of business, but there's a kind of national frame around it. And how does that kind of frame things? Now, just before I began the fieldwork with the Bank of Scotland, they decided to merge with Halifax to form something called HBOS, which meant that there was a corporate merger between a Scottish bank and an English bank, and there were the usual tensions one gets in corporate mergers that were being kind of filtered through national identities. So fate changed the nature of the project, as it were. It was a kind of again, the implicitness, this time we were trying to make it more implicit, was again forced by historical circumstances to be more explicit, as you had people mobilizing different notions of English and Scottish identity overlapped with different notions of the cultures of the two banks and how they related to banking and stuff. And that eventually led to another book after, writing some articles, putting it down, and much later I kind of came back to that material and looked at it after the 2008 financial crisis, and HBOS had folded in the crisis, and it kind of looked, the whole picture of anxieties around this merger looked different now that you knew that the whole thing was heading towards a fall, as it were. And there again, it was more like, I went to work every day in a suit and sat at a desk with a computer, and often asked myself, what am I doing here? I should be out studying nationalism. But in some ways, nonetheless, it leads to those moments where you have kind of certain rich encounters that provide a lot more. Two things I'll say just kind of sort of parenthetically is, one of the advantages for me of going to study in Scotland has been that I didn't have to learn a different language. Many ethnographers, do have to learn another language, and I kind of weaseled my way out of that one. And it also raises questions about, large and small degrees of difference, right? In terms of the kind of culture barrier that we're kind of working on. The other was that, I didn't intend to move to Scotland and work at the University of Edinburgh. So joining the sociology department, first politics and sociology, now sociology at the University of Edinburgh, meant that it was kind of like you moved to the village of your people that you were studying and said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life here. And so something about that kind of ethnographic distance crumbles, when you move to the place where you're studying. You're not going back somewhere carrying goods from afar to some population that don't know what it's like in Scotland. You're kind of here. So that's an interesting kind of wrinkle in how it works. I would echo something, just kind of talking a bit about, so that's the work I've done, but just to kind of echo some things Jon said. I think once in a seminar with Jon, I said to him, taking this ethnographic approach to the study of nationalism was a bit like what they say about flying an airplane. It's hours of boredom punctuated by seconds of terror, and often the kind of ethnographic waiting for it to happen. It has that quality of when's it going to happen, and then it happens. But there it is kind of at times a bit anxiety producing when you're not using interviews and other things to chase the thing. I think another thing I've always puzzled with, partly, as you get older and you have a family and various things, ethnography is an awful hard thing to do. And in recent years, I've tended to do more kind of historical research and theoretical stuff. And I haven't done active ethnography in a long time, as Jon was saying. But it always struck me that the relationship to theory is kind of puzzling, because ethnographic research, like various kinds of case study oriented research, is so focused on the unique, the particularistic, the what's distinct, what's non-repeatable about what you're looking at. But there's always this kind of struggle of how do you relate it to theory. And I find that when I'm doing ethnography, I almost never have a kind of a large explanatory theory that I'm trying to fit it into. Instead, it's this kind of business of I collect data, interviews, code, start to get a sense of what's going on there. And triggers in my mind various kind of concepts that I'm using. I'm realizing I'm thinking a lot about culture here or identity there, or and what do I mean by those concepts. But there's something about ethnography that I find is a kind of concept testing research method more so than a theory validating or unvalidating method, right? There's something I like that reflectiveness about concepts, but there's something about that. And so in doing work on nationalism, it's, what do we mean by culture? What do we mean by national identity? What do we mean by these things? It has kind of been trying to extract wider lessons out of the ethnographic data. The other thing I would say is also that, and again, this probably has to do with why I drifted a bit towards more historical research some of the time, is that I do tend to see the stuff we get when we're studying people ethnographically up close as, to some degree, you're watching people who are being moved about and affected by larger historical currents that they don't have control over, right? Responding to things that they may perhaps even not conscious that that's what they're responding to. So I do find myself thinking about what are those large political, economic, historical processes that this is giving me a kind of snapshot view into, right? But there's something about looking at it that way. It also means that the explanation for what you're looking at is coming from outside. You bring this data to some other sets of, again, conceptual, theoretical ideas that you bring from outside about what's going on with this historical moment, this process of change, the financial crisis, as I was talking about in regard to the bank. And it's, again, it's not like, it's not like you're testing theory with the data, but you're, there's this kind of weird tension, because you're collecting lots of rich data, but then you're not generating a theory from within the data itself. And so this makes me rather different from people who take more microsociological approaches, where it's the interactionism itself. There are certain theories about social interaction and how it happens in the kind of microsociological setting that is providing the theoretical explanation. It's not that I don't think there's, relevant theoretical stuff, but because I'm often more interested in the large kind of historical stuff that's framing what people are doing, that doesn't emerge out of the data itself. So there's this kind of tension between the data you've got and you're reading and thinking about other processes that are not coming from the kind of dense, thick ethnographic data you've collected. That's always been a kind of a chin scratcher for me. Exactly, what am I doing here? And then I just go ahead and write whatever I write and take my chances. But so I guess that's me kind of describing myself. I think we are open to people putting questions in the Q&A and asking us. I'm checking and not seeing that I'm getting fed anything from either Q&A and chat. But, so, I mean, the first thing is to say, okay, everybody out there in TV land, you're invited to start asking us questions. But in the meantime, I think, maybe I'll just try and ask these guys some questions and keep the conversation rolling. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Ellie, do you have a kind of sense of where you stand on this question of, is the theoretical conceptual stuff coming from within the data that you collect? Like, questions about what does it mean to be reflexive or whatever, versus this question of the problem of always having to give it meaning by finding stuff that's from the outside that helps enhance its, the significance of the data.
Yeah, I can give that a stab. I mean, I think before I kind of answer that question, what I thought was interesting, Jonathan, about what you were saying was this almost the tension between concepts and theory. And I mean, I say that because I've just recently finished a book manuscript, and the theoretical stuff, kind of the theoretical contribution or the theoretical model, is like something that I've struggled with so many times in rewriting that chapter. Whereas the conceptual stuff, I think, is more obvious to me. Like, it's more obvious when you're juxtaposing how concepts are being framed in the literature and then how they kind of appear, or that kind of dialogue. And I think that that's also my answer to the question is, when I teach methodology, right, we typically think of like an inductive approach, where you kind of look at theory after data, or look at theory in relation to data, whereas a deductive approach is that kind of more theory testing. And the way that I reconcile for myself is like that it's iterative, right? That it is that kind of that dialogue, that people call it like puzzling or circling or whatever, but that there's not really a beginning and an end point to that relationship between data and theory. That before I went to the field, I had certain literature expectations. One of the most problematic for me was like the salience of the Russian question, or the presence of Russian citizenship in Crimea, and just totally finding it absent. That was one of the more obvious things. But there was a whole bunch of kind of theoretical expectations that I was going to the literature, having read stuff on everyday nationalism, having read stuff on banal nationalism, and then trying to do it. So I don't, like, it's never tabula rasa, but I think a lot of the stuff comes afterwards. And I think that's why I would talk about a kind of iterative dialogue between data and theory. Because it's also about listening and learning. And I think if I'd like stopped reading after I left the field, that was also been problematic, because a lot of the things that I was seeing in the data, again, had to be kind of triggered as you talked about it. Like, you have to kind of then think about what this means and how you wrap it up, and kind of how you come to that process in analysis. Yeah, thank you. I also have some questions if there's opportunity to throw some stuff back.
I'm starting to get some questions coming in, but Jon, do you want to just kind of respond to anything at this point before I start?
I mean, I can do, and I can ask questions as well. It's up to you, Jon. I mean, whether we want to kind of open the floor, questions are starting to come in. So what do you think?
Since we have guests, why don't we turn to their questions, and then we can get on to our own if we're
Excellent.
Happy. So I'll take one from the chat line and then go to the Q&A. Somebody's just asked, is there such a thing as digital ethnography or ethnography of online communities? I don't do it myself, but yes, there is, and sometimes it can be very interesting to. One of the things about digital ethnography is you often do it through certain platforms, and often the stuff you're looking for is kind of pre-packaged and assembled there in this platform where everybody's talking about some nationalist project or issue or something. So it has this, I think I would say the digital ethnography has built into it, hey, these problems of, what's it, are you getting a kind of flattened two-dimensional experience of people? That's not the same as living with them and talking to them, but also this question of, usually you do it through a forum that is already channeling and packaging the stuff and putting it in one place for you. I don't know, have you guys ever done anything with digital ethnography and nationalism?
Not myself. I've supervised students who've done some stuff and had some interesting approaches to the question. So yeah, no, I'm too old for that. But I'm really intrigued by it. I think it has. So there's the version that you're talking about, Jonathan, where you choose the sort of, you kind of sample on your kind of variable, and you can choose nationally defined digital spaces as the place to begin your ethnography, and I think that's really interesting. But you can also look at the wider world, the wider digital world, and treat that as one of many manifestations of everyday life, and do the wait and listen approach, right, which can be really dull when you're trolling through Twitter looking for nationhood or something. But I think it's I think it's interesting for the same reasons. So I wouldn't. Obviously, the specific methods require modifications and stuff, but I don't see it as methodologically that different from the types of ethnography that we're discussing. You just have to, it's a new site for your methodology, and so you have to adapt to that site and think about how to best go about observing everyday life in that particular digital environment. Like any other research, it depends on what you're after, what you're looking to study and stuff. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm interested more and more in digital versions of nationalism, but I haven't done the research myself yet.
I'll just, before turning to Ellie, I'll just insert that obviously we're at a point where one might argue that any study of nationalism is incomplete without, including a digital dimension. But is there something that you cover in your methods teaching, Ellie, or?
No, it isn't, because I think unless you have done it, I think it's really difficult to teach, because we do have a whole course on ethnography, and I think it is covered there, but like when we teach intro, we are traditional in the ways that we teach methods, but I haven't done it myself, but like explicitly I haven't done digital ethnography. But I would say something that I did do is try to like immerse myself in like digital culture. So like I watched a lot, probably too much, I watched a lot of like, what are Russian national groups producing in Crimea, and trying to like observe that before I went to the field. But it made me think also of Jon's comment about over-determining the nation, because by doing that, I thought that was somehow representative of how national identity and nationalism would be understood within Crimea, and actually then being there and kind of contrasting these kind of products of nationalism with actually everyday life was really informative, because it was like, no, politically you understand that they're totally marginal, that perspective is totally marginal, and very fringe. And so it was interesting and useful to do it as a kind of way of getting into the field. But I think for me, what was really interesting was, as I said, that kind of contrast. And I think just knowledge acquisition in general, and I know that there are some questions about outsiders that we might get to, but for me, like kind of acquisition of knowledge and acquisition of understanding kind of cultural practices and norms in the field, but also before doing field work, was really informative and important.
Let me, we're starting to pile up questions here, so let's get on to some of them. I'm going to kind of put two together because they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. Charan Sanghul has asked, as ethnographers, how do we deal with positionality if we are to study societies that we are not native of? And Rachel in the chat line has said, are there any advantages to doing ethnographic study in a culture or society of which you are not a member? So how do we deal with the problem of not being a member and how, or being an outsider, and but are there advantages to not being a member? They're kind of classic ethnographic questions. Do you want to come, and the positionality makes me think of what you were saying about reflexivity earlier, Ellie, but do you want to start us off? Or?
Yeah, so this is something that I think about a lot, and something that I try to encourage students to think about a lot. And by doing that, I think it's useful to like disrupt the binary of insider and outsider, that no one is really all or nothing. And I think it's more useful to think about it as a spectrum, and how over time, right, you can shift those roles as well. That when you first go to the field, you might feel totally on the outside, and then by kind of gaining friends and making acquaintances with people like you kind of shift those roles. And I think it's the same when people do ethnography of places that they're from. Say that you go to an institution and you kind of get elite education, and then go back to where you're doing, to where you grew up. You're not necessarily even an insider in that situation as well. So I think disrupting those kind of binaries is important. But to kind of take back to the premise of the question, so my experience obviously was being an outsider, not being a native speaker, not, to be honest, always having amazing linguistic capacity in Russian and Romanian, but trying to get by. And yeah, as I talked about, I think there were certain advantages, but there are also disadvantages, in the sense that playing the naive researcher allows you to ask really stupid questions, sometimes deliberately, right? Because it's interesting to, okay, how would you explain like your understanding of history to this naive person that's asking you these ridiculous questions, in a way that an insider just wouldn't, because they would already be established within frames of reference. Like if I was Romanian or if I was Moldovan, I wouldn't be told those stories in the same way, and I wouldn't be positioned in the same way. But I think one of the problems that I experienced, well, I'll kind of reflect on two. The first being that people position me as more objective because I was an outsider, and I don't know if that discourse is always useful. Like, you have no stake here, therefore you can judge us and tell us who is right and who is wrong. And I think that again, it kind of is one thing to be mindful of, is how people then position you as an outsider and as this kind of objective person that you're trying to fight against. And the second is what it means to be a female lone researcher in the field, right? The positionality also has to engage with what fieldwork is asking you to do. So something that I've been writing about recently is kind of doing the methods appendix for my book, is reflecting on how weird it is to do fieldwork, that it's going out and asking strangers and calling up strangers, and asking them to engage with you, and what some of the negative interactions that can come out of that would be. Again, that kind of weirdness, where are the boundaries of kind of acceptability, and potentially putting yourself in situations of danger as well. And I think it's important to be mindful of that, not to be fearful, but to be aware that fieldwork is weird, and you need to not do things that make you feel uncomfortable, and to know where those boundaries are, so that you can kind of, and that we need to talk about that as well, that, you know, that fieldwork and positionality is also one where the researcher is a human and can come across situations that make them feel uncomfortable, and that needs to be, I think, a more frank and open discussion than some of the methodological literature, kind of where we're at currently in those discussions.
Do you want to add anything to that, John, or shall I move on to another question?
Oh no, I've got something. Just quickly. I mean, so the inside or outside, you know, the kind of being not to draw too sharp of a distinction between insider and outsider, where Ellie began what she was saying, I think is a really important thing to reiterate. And Jonathan, you are the kind of example of that. I mean, you know, linguistically, you may be the insider, although I'm not sure about that when I visit Scotland. But you know, you may feel yourself the insider, but I'm sure it was a gradual process of feeling that as well. And yes, so that's it. I think there is a process of becoming more of an insider, but I also think it can go the other way as well, where you surprise yourself by how much of an outsider you can be. I just wanted to say that in terms of choosing a research site as an in inverted commas now, insider or outsider. Well, first of all, most of us don't choose research sites in that way. There's something else that leads us to particular research sites. So you work with what you have, and you're one version or both versions or some sort of a hybrid version of those sorts of things. I think the key thing with this kind of reflexivity is to be aware of how your presence affects the data that you generate, that you're collecting in the field, right? And Ellie gave an example of that. And my national identity research, my short-lived national identity research with Transylvania villagers. I mean, they felt that they had to tell me these things because I was an outsider. I didn't know these things, and they wanted to educate me and to tell me in great detail, far more detail than I wanted, about these sorts of things. And they wouldn't have been able to do that to a Hungarian researcher, because that Hungarian researcher would share the same background knowledge that they were making explicit to me. So, so there are advantages and disadvantages of all these things. Is being aware of those advantages and disadvantages, and more importantly, how those things impact the quality of the data that you're generating, or the nature of the data that you're generating, and reflecting on that. So, yeah, I would just add that.
Thanks. I'm going to keep charging ahead because we're piling up some questions here. Here's one from Ty Butler. It is Indigenous Peoples Day today in the US, and I am curious how in your ethnographic research and analysis you separate concepts of indigeneity, if you do, from concepts of modern nationhood. Should they be essentially treated as the same or similar things, only with different focuses on historical intersections of political and power narratives? So has anybody pondered this question of what's the difference between ethnographic study of Indigenous people versus just modern nationals? So. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm going to say, the basic ethnographic problem is, studying people in some other identity category that has some sort of spatial communal definition to it. And all, it really depends on the context of who you're talking about, but Indigenous peoples may or may not be kind of spatially communally concentrated compared to, nationals who are kind of, more just generally distributed throughout some larger territory. But do either of you guys have any experience with this question?
I mean, I could talk a little bit about Crimea, because what's interesting and in contemporary politics problematic about Crimea is these kind of, to say they're contested claims of indigeneity would be to make each party kind of balanced, but I'll provide some background. So Crimean Tatars in Crimea, they were forcibly deported by the Soviet Union in 1944, and many, so they were kind of deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan, and many died en route, and since Perestroika have been able to return. I mean, since Crimean annexation, the situation has got even worse, but I wasn't studying kind of Crimean Tatars directly, but what I was interested in is particularly kind of Russian nationalist, kind of extremely pro-Russian people in Crimea, how these claims of indigeneity and contested indigeneity kind of arose. And again, this was not something that I went out looking for, but it was how people were articulating what claims to Crimea looked like, and how people would kind of position and talk about Crimean Tatars in ways that are really problematic as kind of, Soviet collaborators, Nazi collaborators, or as not the only community with rights to claim indigeneity in Crimea, and to think about, again, these kind of self-other boundaries and how they're being constructed. So, I kind of observed it on the opposite side, right, to see how people would contest those claims of indigeneity and construct self-other boundaries to kind of other that community that in many ways has way more rights to claim indigeneity to Crimea than Russians have, because but in so doing they were trying to buffer themselves as like legitimate residents, and that Crimea was legitimately Russian and pro-Russian because they'd always been there, and that just demographically is not the case. So that's kind of how I would say it. And I would go back to what you were saying, Jonathan. I think like the contextual specificity that you need to think about how these terms operate in the place that you're working, and whether not just necessarily follow the politics, but also interrogate the politics where potentially claims of indigeneity haven't been introduced, but that not all concepts are going to work in the same way in the same place, and kind of then have that kind of contextual groundedness as well.
I'm going to there's a question directed at Jon, so I'm going to send it his way here. Says, dear Professor Fox, I am a PhD candidate in sociology who is also trying to do research with the everyday ethnicity theory. I am now confused about the practical meaning of such kind of research. Personally, I feel like to be equipped with a kind of view, while I feel like I'm equipped with a kind of view while I also feel powerless while facing ethnic conflicts and issues related to inequalities. I don't know whether this theory and our research will make any contributions to the society. That's I would say you're setting a very high bar for yourself in the first place. But Jon, do you want to respond to that at all? Or?
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, yeah. I don't know what to say. I mean, so what's the question? Is it what is the contribution of everyday ethnicity to society? I mean, it seems to be that's kind of what's coming out of it. Although this is the frustration in forums like this. So who asked the question, Jonathan?
Sorry, it was Alex Chilagir.
Yeah, so Alex, come back, and unfortunately you have to type your question again. If I'm answering the wrong question, then just tell me that, and we'll get back to it, or join the queue and we can come back to it. So it's an interesting question. I guess the first thing I would say is that, I personally don't offer a theory of ethnicity or everyday ethnicity. I don't think it's really a theory. I'm more on Ellie's side in terms of a kind of methodological approach to the study of things in everyday life. So I'm not, so theory feels a bit strong for me. That's not a way to kind of avoid the question, but it's a way to kind of just situate my answer to the question. I think you should not feel constrained by what you're referring to as theories of everyday ethnicity, whether you're ascribing that to me or to someone else or anyone who's working in this field. If it's not doing the work that you wanted to do, then find a theory that is, and if you're interested in these inequalities and these questions that you're talking about here, then you have plenty of things to choose from, and I would encourage you to do that. And I'm sure all that stuff does intersect with ethnicity, with nationalism. I mean, I certainly am motivated by many of those concerns myself, although it's not, a research question in itself. And there is a lot of interesting research done on these questions of nationalism and ethnicity and inequalities. From kind of neo-Marxian perspectives and also ethnographic perspectives, and the book that I wrote with my colleagues on nationalist politics and everyday ethnicity in Transylvania was critiqued for its lack of explicit focus on kind of class questions and inequality questions. But I think those things are, and I think that's fair critique too. It wasn't the explicit focus of what we were doing. But it can be done. I mean, and I think you can, if your question is about making everyday ethnicity relevant to questions of inequalities, then that shouldn't be it could be a criticism of existing work, but it could be an invitation for you to go fix that problem and go think about, what that means. And again, how you do that depends on the kind of context you're talking about, where you're approaching these things, what the specific configuration is of things. So it's hard to kind of speak generally about this, but if it's about linking everyday ethnicity or everyday nationalism to inequalities, I think one that has been done, I think it can be done, and it can be done productively. So I would encourage you to do that. I'm not sure that that's what you were asking. So if I've answered the wrong question, come back to us in the chat. Okay.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a question from Chen Tao, who I happen to know is it's the wee hours in China, so we should help this person before they get off to sleep. She says, I have two questions. One, who is ordinary in ethnography and in everyday nationalism? I'm claiming that I'm interacting with ordinary people in my fieldwork, but within these people, there are always some powerful ones who exactly are the ordinary? Second, in my fieldwork, I also feel that most of the time the nation is not being mentioned or presented. How can we engage that kind of indifference or void into the analysis of nationhood, which is kind of getting back to what both John and I were saying, these long periods where you're looking for it, but it's not there. You've written a lot, John, about everyday nationalism. I mean, this problem of, are people ordinary, the claim that you're trying to get at ordinary people, or, what is that?
I've written about it a lot, but never said anything very concrete or useful about it. I mean, precisely because of the question is the right question to ask. I don't think there is a very good answer to it. Well, first, to give some background context, recently I was told off by Gurmeendra Bamra for using the term ordinary for its kind of normalizing assumptions, and I think she was right about that. And I've tried to kind of move away from that. I think. So the critique that's implicit in the question, I completely agree with it. I mean, it's an unsatisfactory category. There's no clear-cut distinction. I like to treat it, I like to think of it as a kind of residual category. When we're done talking about the people who are not ordinary, then we're left with people who are ordinary. I don't know. It's trying to identify the agents of everyday life, and those aren't just ordinary people by any stretch. I mean, there isn't a definite category of ordinary people. So it's the people, and the people who are engaging in the practices of everyday life. And when you think about that, when you think about that, that can be anyone. I mean, when we're out doing participant observation or ethnography or something, you know, we're not asking for people's credentials and then trying to take a decision as to whether they're ordinary or not ordinary. We're participating in everyday life, which involves people of diverse backgrounds and diverse statuses and whatnot. And so I think we should be, and you know, to the extent it's feasible, we should be aware of those sorts of things, but we should try to avoid these kind of pigeonholing. So I know that I have used the term before. Gurminda gave me one good reason to use it, and since then I can think of a lot of other good reasons. One good reason not to use it, and I can think of other good reasons not to use it as well. So I guess I would try to distance myself from that a little bit and focus more on the practices that we all engage in, the ordinary, not ordinary, but the everyday practices we engage in, irrespective of our particular status or identity or something like that.
Thanks. Do you want to add anything there, Ellie? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can offer a better definition than Jon just did in terms of the agents of everyday life. And it's definitely a term that I've used in my own work and feel unsatisfied by. And I think the critique is totally justified, and I would be curious what categories we could use instead. And I don't want to put all of my weight behind keeping using ordinary, but I will kind of discuss why I think it's important in political science to at least have some recognition of this category, even if we change how we talk about it, because a lot of political science is elite focused, it's state oriented, it cares about people who do hold political office or are policymakers. And I think that leaves out a whole swathe of people, and those people are often only studied through use of surveys. So again, I think it's contextually specific in relation to what you're railing against, and what I rail against is the fact that ordinary people are engaging in everyday life in ways that are politically consequential, and we need to recognize that and capture it and understand the role that they're playing in politics, rather than just to kind of subsume that they're totally irrelevant. And so I think it's also, so whatever that term might be, I think it still has a political and methodological function, which is to reshift the kind of power dynamics of who is considered to be important. That's why I kind of talk about what I do as not elite interviews. The way that I seek to generate knowledge is totally antithetical to elite interview methods, and that everyone is relevant. But it's different and it's important. And if we don't do that, we have a much more kind of narrow and insufficient understanding of politics. So that's kind of my perspective. Do you want me to tackle a little bit of the second part of that question?
Yeah, if you felt able to.
Because I mean, it's not something that I engaged with in my comments, but reflecting on both of the Jonathan and Jon's comments, it was something that I was thinking about, which was the ease of which it was possible for me to do the kind of work that I did in Crimea and Moldova. And I would not say it's because I was particularly skilled at interviewing. I definitely wasn't. And Liam Fuji talks about this kind of, what I often think about as a cliche, is like mistakes are gifts, that you learn by doing things badly. And there's nothing quite like looking over interview transcripts that you did 10 years ago to realize all the mistakes that you made. But again, that's learning. But I never had a problem finding interviewees and finding the nation and getting people to talk about it. And I wondered whether it was this kind of spectrum or kind of two dimensions of salience and contestation. And in a way, both of the cases that I work on have figure relatively high, both in terms of salience and contestation, not because I think identity politics matters in the way that people often suggest it matters, like it's the only thing that matters in Moldovan politics. I think that's what Jon Fox was talking about in terms of over-determining the nation, but that it is a part of everyday speech, citizenship in particular, that it is something that people are contesting and articulating in everyday life. And so I think it's also worth me reflecting and being open about the fact that I found it relatively easy, not because I was skilled, just because it was there. And I think then the challenge for everyday nationalism is kind of invert that question of when does it work and when does it not work, and what situations of contestation or salience might make less sense for this kind of method, and what might make more sense. So that was kind of my, I guess, answer and also follow-up question. potentially as well.
I'm going to just kind of jump a little bit, just because in the chat line, Hans Siebers has sort of followed up on this question and said, in line with the previous question about ordinary people, what is everyday life? I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. I mean, I've got other questions I want to get onto, but I just wanted to insert in this conversation. I mean, I think we've already kind of addressed some of this already, but there's also a way in which, these notions of ordinary people or everyday life sort of stand in the place of some sort of notion of authenticity. And there's something about that I think, we have to be careful about, because on one hand, you're just trying to say you want to find the stuff that's unmediated through, lots of manipulation by political people and your own conceptual apparatus. But in that kind of search for the ordinary or the everyday, there is kind of hiding behind there a kind of notion that there's something authentic that you could get at if you filtered out this stuff. And I want to kind of throw up a health warning and say, I think there's value in trying to find these kind of less mediated forms of presentation of national stuff, but there's also a danger in deceiving yourself into thinking you're kind of getting at the real thing, because the real thing is very hard to. There's a question of whether we should believe it's there or it's very hard to find. So, let me try to keep track of the time. And there's another one in the chat line that's been waiting for a while from Stefan Morer, which just says, what should the observation grid of an ethnographer interested in national identity look like? I can't say I've ever used anything called an observation grid. I'm not that methodical, but do either of you guys have any experience with I mean, or we could be using the term more kind of metaphorically, but kind of a notion of what's the observation grid or checklist or things that you're looking for when you're doing ethnography?
I don't think there should be one. I mean, I think it's more, that I mean, I guess that's what I was trying to say with the wait and listen thing. Yeah, I think you just need to be open to different sorts of possibilities, and the things that end up ticking your boxes, are really difficult to identify in advance. I mean, in Transylvania, it turned out one of the things that ticked the national identity box was stuffed cabbage, a kind of conversation or actually a rather animated argument between a Romanian wife and a Hungarian husband about the national origins of stuffed cabbage, which I of course inserted that it was Serbian and neither Hungarian nor Romanian. But it's a kind of, you have to be, you don't go with a list that's got stuffed cabbage on it, or food even necessarily on it, although food may be more reasonable than stuffed cabbage. I think you just have to, you have to be attuned to what is happening and what national work it's doing, because the stuffed cabbage one was an easy one because it was a nationalist argument about the national origins of this food, but it's the subtler versions that I think are difficult, or the more implicit versions that I mentioned earlier that I think are more difficult to kind of get at, and you can hear them without really registering the national work that they're doing. So I think the list, the observational grid, as you call it, comes is that kind of more inductive approach that Ellie was talking earlier. Although, as she said too, that inductive approach is an iterative process between both inductive and deductive. So you can perhaps think of some things, some categories, some possibilities beforehand, but then it's don't be too constraining, because I think the question, what you want to do is not miss things rather than miss things. And I just want to come back very quickly to Hans's question, because it was such a predictably good question to ask on the back of the ordinary thing, and bring that back to something Ellie said. I mean, the work that everyday life and ordinary people are doing in our work, or at least in my work, I think, if I understood Ellie correct, I think it's similar. is fixing a problem in the scholarship. So I completely agree, Jonathan, with what you're saying about authenticity and the search for authenticity. I agree with all these critiques, although everyday life at least has a strong theoretical tradition behind it, so we can lean on those people if we so choose to. Ordinary people doesn't have the same thing. What we're trying to do is fix a problem in the scholarship on nationalism, which is a history of approaching things implicitly, sometimes explicitly as well, from this kind of top-down perspective, and forgetting to ask the basic question of who cares, right? And so I'm not sure who the who is in this who cares question, but it goes somehow beyond this narrow strata of people, you know, historians, politicians, language specialists, all these sorts of people who are materially and otherwise symbolically invested in nationalism. So it's everybody else, and that everybody else is a very nebulous concept. It's difficult to identify, but it's getting at the kind of routine, the routine practices, the exchanges, the encounters, the habits, the institutional forms of nationhood, rather than the more spectacular stuff. And I think there is reason to study that. It can't be cordoned off. We can't sort of identify and say, here is this domain and it doesn't intersect with others. That's ridiculous. And I'm even more skeptical now of this ordinary people idea. But I still see the same problems that Ellie has identified in much of the scholarship, which is these questions about the kind of relevance of nationalism beyond that kind of narrow stratum is a problem that needs to be addressed. So I think that's what all of us are trying to do in some sense, is think that through.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm just going to comment on the side also that we seem to be getting a lot of questions from people, PhD students, people involved in field work, people kind of, you know, really wrestling immediately with these issues. And that's great, you know, because that's what, you know, this kind of thing should be for, is to help people who are doing it think about it. I'm going to at least a couple more questions here. One from Ayup Mert Berdal. Thank you for the fruitful discussions. Oops, I'm just skipping around here. Thank you for the fruitful discussions. Could it be possible to generate or test theories of national identity through ethnography combined with the grounded theory approach? I don't know, that's a somewhat, I mean, grounded theory is an interesting thing here because it's a kind of, it's a method for producing theory, as it were, or you know. Ellie, do you have any thoughts on that one, or?
Yeah, I mean, the first that I would say, I mean, I don't do grounded theory myself, and I've always been curious to hear from people that do grounded theory. I mean, I'm on the sociological side of political science, or the political side of sociology, so I don't think it's the most common method amongst the people that I might interact with, but I will say that it is similar to what I was talking about earlier in terms of that kind of iterative or inductive approach. It is probably more on the side of not tabula rasa, but the kind of absence of literature until data collection. But it's definitely not a theory testing perspective, right? And I don't think any of us are theory testing ethnographers or theory testing ethnographic sensibility. I think that is not the way that people like us do research, right? Which is more about theory development. I wouldn't even necessarily say generation, because I think that also speaks to almost like an invention. I don't think any of us are like going out into the field and saying like, oh, this is this unique thing that I found that just like generated out of data. It's a dialogue, it's a discussion, it's an interaction, and it's what Jon Fox was talking about as well. It's this feeling unsatisfied by where we are, and how do we rail against and push against those assumptions and challenge those assumptions and kind of create that broader dialogue out of the things that we're observing. So that would be my answer to that question, is more a kind of, yeah, definitely theory generation or theory development, I was kind of preferred to call it. And I think that that's what a lot of us are doing. Yeah, and I'm happy to share any literature that would be useful and iterative approaches with kind of come out of sociology, and yeah.
Let's move on to another. We have another question. Now this person is just anonymous attendee, so no name attached. But the question regards individual interviews. Have you ever encountered the issue, what they call the issue of obviousness of national practice among your interviewees? By issue of obviousness, I mean that the level of internalization of some national performances is so high that the interviewees are not reflective on their actions. They just reproduce it. If so, how did you manage to extract more reflective responses? So this is the case where it's not the problem that John and I have talked about, where they never say anything that seems national, but rather they do it in such a routinized, conventionalized way that it doesn't. It's hard to break under the skin of that quality. I'll just make an anecdote here, which is when I was doing my PhD research on nationalism, I was speaking to the novelist Willie McIlvanney, who was a kind of Scottish crime novelist and important figure in the kind of networks of people, kind of pro-devolution people. And he had me meet him in the ubiquitous Chip, famous place in Glasgow, and sat there and talked. And after about a minute or two of talking, I realized that he was almost saying verbatim something I had read him write in one of his books, because there's this, in that case, you're dealing with a figure who gets asked questions so many times that they have a pattern that they're not even conscious of, right? And they just reproduce it almost automatically. Now that's somewhat different from what this questioner is asking about, which has more to do with just how normal people kind of do these conventionalized displays and don't. How do you crack underneath that? I think. Either of you want to pick up on that? Or?
Can I also add a third dimension, which goes back a bit to something else, but the routinized and obvious, the absent and the cliched, because I think. So I've never actually had a problem with cliches. I think that they're actually interesting, right? When you just hear people repeating tropes, I mean, obviously you want to go beyond the superficial and the surface level, but I still think it's interesting when you kind of contrast who is repeating that kind of cliched and who is articulating through those cliches and who isn't. So I just wanted to add that to the mix, and I don't know if you wanted to discuss that also, but I think that they're still useful to understand where those cliches and how those cliches and why those cliches are being reproduced. But on the issue of obviousness, I don't know, and it takes me back to this kind of salience versus contestation, because I would say maybe even in Moldova more than Crimea, because people were literally disputing history within their own families, right? Like who were the occupiers and who were the freedom fighters in the Second World War, and this was how history was being reconstructed, reinterpreted, and there were literally like generational differences within every family with kind of which narrative was being repeated and contested. I think it made that level of internalization possibly less self-evident, and because it was kind of in opposition to contestation. But what I would say, and it's never something that I've studied directly, and I think it would be actually quite hard to study it directly, but where I did see this kind of routinization was in the way that people would talk about religion. Because in Moldova, there's two churches, Orthodox churches. There's the Moldovan Orthodox Church that's kind of under the Russian Patriarch, and then there's the Bessarabian Orthodox Church that's under the Romanian Patriarch. And getting people to talk about religious practice in a way that aligned, like which metropolitan, which Orthodox church are you, where do these religious practices come from, was really hard, because that people couldn't articulate themselves in a way that seemed to suggest that boundary really existed in practices. And I think that that's interesting. I mean, that would be something to study in its own right, but it was almost so routinized and so obvious and so messy that people didn't have a good understanding or couldn't articulate that level of understanding in a way that it became obvious where those boundaries kind of existed. yes, again, I think it comes back to the contextual specificity and the way that identity and the way that national identity are kind of infused and contested in the first place.
Okay. John, did you have anything you wanted to add there, or?
It's definitely a topic that interests me, and so I mean, this is the theme section, Nations and Nationalism, that we were working on a few years ago, Jonathan. The evidence is what I described, what Martin and I described as the evidence problem. So how do you deal with this kind of implicit knowledge, these sorts of background expectancies, as Harold Garfinkel refers to them. So the things that we don't have to make explicit, that we don't have to account for very often, and then until some strange sociologist comes around knocking on your door asking you to account for them. So my answer to that in that theme section was this kind of Garfinkel-inspired breaching, experiment, metaphorically. I mean, please don't go out and breach like Garfinkel did, because it's not advisable. But the idea that we should look to what I refer to as the edges of the nation, so places where there's this kind of wiggle space between the implicit and the explicit, and try to think about those sorts of contexts as research sites, so that we can perhaps get a little bit more leverage into the implicit. But I mean, I don't think that's even always required. I don't think we need to only kind of develop special research designs to kind of get at this sort of things. But it's just keen ethnography that is required to appreciate these things and understand it. And the work, I'm glad Ellie raised the question of cliches. I think cliches are also very interesting, and I think they're kind of, I see them as a kind of holding pattern in response to questions about the implicit. So we don't really know what to say. We scratch our head a little bit, we might laugh, and then we kind of fall back on cliches. So I have my undergraduates do this. They have them do all sorts of tasks, but one of the things I asked them to do is to interview their flatmates or their girlfriends or whatever about what it means to be British. And I do this to show how people respond in these really funny ways. I mean, they laugh, they kind of guffaw, they do make all sorts of embodied responses to this, and then they kind of go to the Queen and tea and Spitfires or whatever, and then very often it stops there. But then sometimes they go a bit further. A few of them, a minority of them, will go a bit further and try to articulate something a little bit more personal, a little bit more kind of meaningful. But it's a challenge, and accept it as a challenge, and see if you can find ways to meet that challenge. So yeah, good luck.
Okay, I think we're getting close to 90 minutes here, and there was a kind of comment rather than question that I kind of skipped over earlier because I was trying to prioritize questions, but we can kind of conclude with this one from Leela Wilmers. Thanks for very interesting contributions. A comment. Jon Fox talked about the limitations of interviews for understanding where nationalism does and doesn't emerge in everyday life. I have found interviews can also reveal a lot through side reactions to the questions. For instance, in politically repressive contexts, national identity can be a sensitive topic, and this can manifest in tensions that can tell us a lot in themselves. Or if people struggle to talk about the nation, this can also be revealing. Perhaps a way of talking about ethnographic sensibility to interviews, as Ellie suggests. So that's a comment, more than a question, but if either of you wanted to, it kind of picks up on things that both of you were saying, if either one of you want to add anything to that.
Just to say, yes, absolutely. I mean, I should have said it's not a limitation of interviews, but a limitation of this interviewer more than anything else. And in fact, I do lots of interviews and focus groups and all sorts of things. And I think I've become a little bit more accomplished than I was in that early stages of my career. But yes, I agree with everything, including the last point that Ellie said.
Like a last word there, Ellie, or?
Yeah, I mean, I also agree, but I think it's worth asking. I mean, it's worth reflecting both on my experience and also the sensitivity that we take to politically repressive contexts, because I would say that I do not have experience of doing research in politically repressive contexts, because even though Crimea is definitely a politically repressive context, I have the privilege of I guess, the privilege and also the curse of deciding not to do the kind of research that I was doing there, because it's just way too dangerous, right? Like I turn up now and oh yeah, so I asked you a whole bunch of questions about what it meant to be Russian and desires of Russian citizenship and understandings of Russia. Can we talk about that again? Absolutely never going to happen, for participant safety and my own safety. And even in Moldova, like Moldova kind of comes in and out of more political and less political repression, and during the years, I guess, really before the last 18 months, I wasn't doing fieldwork there then. And I think so it's worth thinking about the kind of questions, not just the approach that you take, and whether that is doable and feasible in the first place. Not to doubt Leda's expertise, that's not what I'm saying, but more in terms of your own research trajectory as PhD students, thinking about where ethical dilemmas and beyond ethical dilemmas kind of come from, and if those methods put people at more risk and harm, and those kinds of questions put people at more risk of harm than, say, other methods, focus groups, whatever, and kind of identification by the state. In the way political repressive context is very much about avoiding the gaze of the state, and you don't want to shine a light on anything that you're doing and put people at risk by the kinds of questions that you're asking. So I guess my answer to that question is also opting out of those methods when you think that they don't, I'd say, make sense, is too weak, when they're just not an option. Yeah, so that would be my kind of final comment.
Thanks, Ellie. So I think we've been at it for a good hour and a half now, and responded to pretty much all the questions. So I think I just want to say, it's a fascinating discussion. It's nice. I don't get many chances to talk about this, ethnography and nationalism, and it's an enjoyable and very stimulating. So I'll just say, remind people. On the October 28th, there'll be another webinar discussing Will Kerr's new book on Darwinian social evolution and social change, and the evolution of nationalisms. And just remind people to go check out the links to the 2022 ASEN conference on nationalism and media, which will be taking place in Antwerp. Just go to the ASEN webpage and you can find the links there. I'd like to say thanks to Ellie Knott. Thanks to Jon Fox, and thanks to David Cole, the mysterious person behind the curtain who's twiddling all the knobs and making all this work. I think that's us, and he will make us all disappear in just a moment. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening. It's been very, very enjoyable.